Module 2, History of Life on Earth. Most essential learning competency is describe general features of the history of life on Earth, including generally accepted dates and sequence of the geologic timescale, characteristics of major groups of organisms present during these periods. For learning objectives, we're going to describe the origin of history of life on Earth, identify and describe the sequence of the geologic timescale, and understand the importance of the origin of history of life on Earth. As we recall, class, the origin of Earth itself is a complex story. Its surface has undergone a long evolution, experiencing extreme changes over millions of years. While the origin of life on Earth has been a long debated issue, there have been many theories as to how life began. One of the most popular was put forward by Darwin himself, who suggested that a warm little pond could have been the most likely location for life to begin. It is also called as primordial soup. Scientists thought when Earth was young, the oceans were filled with simple chemicals needed for life, and eventually they assembled themselves into simple living cells. But how did the first organisms on the only known home to life in the universe develop from the primordial soup? Another popular theory states that hydrothermal vents along mid-ocean ridges would be an ideal location for the precursors of life to develop. It is also called as the deep-sea vent theory, suggests that life may have begun as submarine hydrothermal vents, spewing key hydrogen-rich molecules, while others propose that life was carried here from elsewhere in the universe and delivered during an asteroid impact. So it means perhaps life did not begin on Earth at all, but was brought here from elsewhere in space, which is also known as panspermia. For instance, rocks regularly get blasted off Mars by cosmic impacts, and a number of Martian meteorites have been found on Earth that some researchers have controversially suggested brought microbes over here, potentially making us all Martians originally. However, even if this concept were true, the questions of how life began on Earth would then only change to how life began elsewhere in space. The earliest Earth was described as a naked planet, having no ocean or atmosphere when it first formed. This eventually appeared around 4.37 billion years ago, after Earth had been pelted or rained by aqueous asteroid material. Once there was liquid water and an atmosphere, there was a greater chance for prebiotic life to form, the chemical precursors to life on Earth. The first traces of life recorded on Earth are thought to be as old as 4.2 billion years, indicating that life may have evolved within 200 million years after the first appearance of liquid water. So the origin of life is one of the great mysteries in the universe. To determine the origin of life, scientists are investigating the problem in several different ways. Some scientists are studying life on our own planet. Some scientists are seeking out life or fossil life on other planets or moons in our solar system. And other scientists are trying to detect life in other solar systems, either by measuring life's effects on the atmospheres of distant planets or by measuring artificial radiation, like radio signals that may be produced by advanced life. Thus far, the most fruitful approach has been to examine life on our own planet. We all know that life began at least 3.5 billion years ago, because that is the age of the oldest rock, with fossil evidence of life on the Earth. And nonetheless, these 3.5 billion-year-old rocks with fossils can be found in Africa and Australia, and they are usually a mix of solidified volcanic lavas and sedimentary turds. Chemical traces of life have also been detected in slightly older rocks. In Greenland, a series of ancient metamorpho sediments have been found. Analysis indicates the sediments were deposited about 3.8 billion years ago. They also revealed carbon isotope signatures that appear to have been produced by organisms that lived when the sediments were deposited. The earliest life forms we know of were microscopic organisms called microbes. The left signals of their presence in rocks about 3.7 billion years old. The signals consisted of a type of carbon molecule that is produced by living things. Evidence of microbes was also preserved in the hard structures known as stromatolites lineage, which date to 3.5 billion years ago. Stromatolites are created as sticky mats of microbes trap and bind sediments into layers. Minerals precipitate inside the layers, creating durable structures even as the microbes die off. Scientists study today's rare living stromatolite reefs to better understand Earth's earliest life forms. The earliest evidence of life comes from biogenic carbon signatures and stromatolite fossils discovered in 3.7 billion-year-old meta-sedimentary rocks from western Greenland. When we say meta-sedimentary rocks, those are type of metamorphic rocks. Such rock was buried underneath subsequent rock and was subjected to high pressures and temperatures, causing the rock to recrystallize. In year 2015, possible remains of biotic life were found. It is also called as potentially biogenic carbon preserve in a 4.1 billion-year-old zircon. Metrical zircons from Jack Hills, Western Australia, range in age up to nearly 4.4 gigayears. That contains primary graphite diffusions. In March 2017, putative or generally considered evidence of possibly the oldest forms of life on Earth was reported in the form of fossilized microorganisms. This may be the oldest known sign of life on Earth, found embedded in crystal. The structures seem to be fossils formed around hydrothermal vents, which precipitates in the Nunavut belt of Quebec, Canada. These tiny hematite tubes were as much as 4.28 billion years old, according to the scientists announcing the find, and they are stunningly similar to structures produced by microbes living around undersea hydrothermal vents. Microbial mats are complex communities of microbes, usually organized into layers. They were one of the earliest ecosystems on Earth. Stromatolites, which is known as the oldest fossils, are microbial mats with a mineral rock component. In the coexistent bacteria and archaea were the dominant form of life in the early Archaean era. The evolution of photosynthesis around 3.5 billion years ago, the atmospheric oxygen resulted from a change to a microbe's metabolism that evolved once, at a specific time in the Earth's history. Available evidence from geological studies of Archaean sedimentary rocks indicates that life existed 3.5 billion years ago, but the question of when oxygenic photosynthesis evolved is still unanswered. But when cyanobacteria evolved at least 2.4 billion years ago, they set the stage for a remarkable transformation. They became Earth's first photosynthesizers, making food using water and the sun's energy, and releasing oxygen as a result. This catalyzed a sudden dramatic rise in oxygen, making the environment less hospitable for other microbes that could not tolerate oxygen. Cyanobacteria remained principal primary producers throughout the Proterozoic eon. The earliest evidence of eukaryotes, a complex cells with organelles, dates from 1.85 billion years ago. But the question is, between prokaryotes and eukaryotes, which type of cells are believed to have evolved first? Scientists have concluded that prokaryote life forms preceded the more complex eukaryotes. All organisms on Earth are classified into two basic cell types. Prokaryotes have DNA in a freely floating ring that is not enclosed in a nucleus. Eukaryotes that have DNA arranged in chromosomes and enclosed in a nucleus. Fossil evidence indicates that prokaryotic cells first existed on the Earth prior to the arrival of the eukaryotes. That prokaryotes may have arisen more than 3.5 billion years ago, and eukaryotes are thought to have first appeared about 1.5 billion years ago. The oldest microfossils that are widely acknowledged as the remains of eukaryotes were found in 1.5 billion-year-old rocks in northern Australia, and the first fossils of prokaryotic cells are known from 3.5 and 3.4 billion years ago, and these bacteria were photosynthetic, although non-oxygen producing. Some examples of prokaryotes are bacteria, archaea, and cyanobacteria, or known as blue-green algae. And some examples of eukaryotic cells are animals and plant cells, fungi, protists such as amoeba and paramecium, and insects have eukaryotic cells. Later, around 1.7 billion years ago, multi-cellular organisms began to appear with differentiated cells performing specialized functions. The trace fossil record suggests that metazoans, multicellular animals, appear to have evolved from single-celled ancestors that developed a colonial habit. were well established by 1 billion years ago, and the great diversity of metazoans of this age suggests that more than one evolutionary line led to multi-cellular development. Lip-shaped fossils in North China suggest that some form of multicellular life had evolved by 1.7 billion years ago. Here are some of the earliest fossil evidences. Trans-Siberian biota. It is also known as Gabon macrofossils. It is a group of 2.1 billion-year-old Proterozoic macroscopic organisms. These fossils are postulated to be evidence of the earliest form of multicellular life. Next we have Tiantian, dated 1.7 billion years ago. It appears to consist of virtually identical cells. These currently living species represent less than 1% of all species that have ever lived on Earth. Morpha pubescens. This fossil of a type of red algae is the oldest example of an organism belonging to an extant phylum. The fossil includes differentiated reproductive cells that are the oldest evidence of sexual reproduction. Protiskia is a fossilized organism found in rocks dated from 1.5 billion years ago to 900 million years ago. Its shape has been described as a string of leaves connected by a very fine thread. It is considered one of the oldest known eukaryotes. The clues in rocks help scientists put together a picture of how places on Earth have changed. Scientists noticed in the year 1700s and 1800s that similar layers of sedimentary rocks all over the world contain similar fossils. They used relative dating to order the rock's layers from oldest to youngest. In the process of relative dating, scientists do not determine the exact age of a fossil, but do learn which ones are older or younger than others. For example, older rock layers contain only reptile fossils, but younger rock layers may also contain mammal fossils. Ordering rock layers from oldest to youngest was a first step in creating the geologic timescale. It showed that order in which life on Earth changed. It also showed us how certain areas change over time in regard to climate or type of environment. However, the early geologic timescale only showed the order of events. It did not show the actual years that events happened. With the discovery of radioactivity in the late 1800s, scientists were able to measure the exact age in years of different rocks. Measuring the amount of radioactive elements in rocks lets scientists use absolute dating to give ages to each chunk of time on the geologic timescale. For example, they are now able to state that the Jurassic began about 200 million years ago and that it lasted for about 55 million years. Stratigraphy applies to sedimentary rock formations. The fundamental principle is that newer layers are always deposited on top of older layers. Therefore, a vertical dig reveals a historical record with deeper digs revealing older sedimentary deposits. However, crustal movements and uplifts may cause these layers to tilt, fold, and even become inverted in some locations. In addition, erosion can cause loss of layers and gaps in the rock record, fold, and conformities. From the given illustration, the steep walls of the Grand Canyon contain a number of layers of sedimentary rock laid down over millions of years. The lower formations belong to the early Precambrian age, while the upper layers are of the Paleozoic age. The line between the two sets of formations is called the Great Unconformity. From the given image of the stratigraphy of the Grand Canyon, we have here at the right side of the first column, layer age in millions of years, and the second column, layer thickness in feet. And we have three sets of rocks. We have the divisional basement rocks, the Grand Canyon supergroup rocks, and the layered Paleozoic rocks. Geologic timescale. Class, come to think of it, how many years is a long time? We often express time in hours or days, and 10 or 20 years certainly feels like a long time. Imagine if you needed to think about 1 million, 100 million, or even several billion years. This exceptional length of time seems unbelievable, but they are exactly the spans of times that scientists use to describe the Earth. Scientists have put together the geologic timescale to describe the order and duration of major events on Earth for the last 4.5 billion years. Some examples of events listed on the geologic timescale include the first appearance of plant life on Earth, the first appearance of animals on Earth, and the formation of Earth's mountains, and the extinction of the dinosaurs. The history of the Earth covers a vast expanse of time, so scientists divide it into smaller sections that are associated with particular events that have occurred in the past. The approximate time range of each time span is shown in the given illustration. The largest time span of the geologic timescale is the eon. It is an indefinitely long period of time, and this geologic time is divided into two eons. The more ancient eon is called the Precambrian, and the more recent is the Phanerozoic eon. Each eon is subdivided into smaller spans called eras. The Precambrian eon is divided from most ancient into the Hadean era, Archaean era, and Proterozoic era. Single-celled and simple multi-celled organisms first developed during the Precambrian eon. There are many fossils from this time because the sea-dwelling creatures were trapped in sediments and preserved. Phanerozoic eon is subdivided into three eras: the Paleozoic era, Mesozoic era, and Cenozoic era. An era is often divided into several smaller time spans called periods. For example, the Paleozoic era is subdivided into the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, and Permian periods. Mesozoic era. It contains the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods, and it is often called the age of the dinosaurs because of its famous inhabitants. The two periods of the Cenozoic era are the Tertiary and Quaternary. A period is divided into an even smaller unit called an epoch. The Tertiary period of the Cenozoic era is comprised of the Paleocene, Eocene, Ordovician, Miocene, and Pliocene. The Quaternary period of the Cenozoic era includes the Pleistocene and Holocene epochs. And the given period of Paleogene period is under Paleocene epoch, and the Neogene period is under Miocene epoch. Here are another models and illustration of geologic timescale. One of the most widely used standard charts showing the relationships between the various intervals of geologic time is the International Chronostratigraphy Chart, which is maintained by the International Commission on Stratigraphy. Why is it important to study the history of life on Earth? Understanding life's origin would lend us a better and wider perspective on what life really is back then. Understanding the processes of life's origin will help us understand where else in the universe life might arise. Studying the origin and earliest evolution of life help us understand why the Earth became habitable and why terrestrial life has persisted for billions of years.
Where did life come from, and how did it come to this? The path from bacteria to baseball wasn't simple. In this mini-series, we're going to explore the evolution of life on Earth. It's been a wild journey, with plenty of twists and turns, and there were a lot of times we almost didn't make it. This first episode is about two of the earliest geological eons, the Archaean and the Proterozoic. Eons are the second largest way to divide up Earth's history, after super eons. There was one geological eon before the Archaean, the Hadean, which was 4.5 to 4 billion years ago, but because Earth's rocks are constantly being destroyed and reshaped, literally all of the rocks that old are gone. It's hard to have geology without rocks, so we're going to start with the Archaean. The Archaean began about 4 billion years ago and ended around 2.5 billion years ago, when the chemistry of rocks began to change, and plate tectonics, the way the Earth's crust moves around, started to become more of a thing. That kicked off the Proterozoic eon, which continued until 542 million years ago. These two eons are where life began and developed in complexity, though it took its sweet time about it. It's also also the time when life transformed the atmosphere, making it more suitable for some living things, but more dangerous for others. Earth and the creatures that live on it have a complex relationship. We've influenced each other. The geology of the planet has guided the evolution of life, and life has shaped Earth just by existing. So Earth's geology during the Archaean shaped what was probably the first forms of life, but you wouldn't recognize the planet. The atmosphere contained a lot of methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and carbon dioxide, a type of chemical mixture that's called a reducing environment, which means it can make electrons available for chemical reaction. That was probably good news for the molecules that would eventually turn into biological molecules. They were able to react with each other and start becoming more complex. Carbon dioxide and methane are greenhouse gases, so the Earth was much hotter then, even though the sun was younger and fainter. In fact, there's no evidence for polar ice caps or glaciers in the Archaean. It was too hot for ice. Meanwhile, the continents were solidifying. Plate tectonics have shuffled them around a whole bunch since then, but the innermost rocky centers of most of today's continents date to the Archaean. Volcanoes belched carbon compounds and water into the atmosphere. The oceans condensed pretty quickly from that water. And because there was almost no oxygen in the atmosphere, there was no ozone layer, UV radiation would have been pretty intense. If you hopped into the TARDIS and time traveled to Archaean Earth, you might think you were on Venus. That's very different from the temperate climate and nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere we have now. So what changed? Well, life happened. At some point in the warm oceans and carbon-rich atmosphere, biological molecules that contained the necessary information to copy themselves and had the chemical ability to do so formed from organic compounds. These became encapsulated in an oily membrane that kept them safe from the outside world, the first things to resemble a living cell. And eventually, this early life transformed the atmosphere and climate. Some scientists believe the earliest biological molecules were RNA, the molecule our DNA now uses to send messages outside a cell's nucleus. It's called the RNA world hypothesis. RNA is very similar to DNA, but it's easier to form from simple components. It also stores genetic information the same way DNA does, but it can tangle itself into shapes that make it easier for chemical reactions to happen, the way proteins do in our cells now. The RNA world hypothesis would explain why RNA is the go-between for DNA and protein in our cells. But some scientists argue it would have been too complicated for life to switch over from RNA to DNA and protein, and it's more likely that all three evolved together. Whether life started as an RNA world or not, by the time the common ancestor of everything alive today came along, the system was based on DNA. The earliest fossils show that life in the form of bacteria existed 3.5 billion years ago, but a recent finding shows that life could be even older than that. A team of researchers from California found evidence of life that is 4.1 billion years old. Now, I just said that there weren't any rocks older than 4 billion years, and there aren't, which means there aren't any fossils either. But the team found resilient little crystals called zircons, which can be preserved when the rock surrounding them is destroyed. Then they get incorporated into new rocks. The zircons in question, found in Australia, contain traces of 4.1 billion-year-old carbon. There are lighter and heavier forms of carbon called isotopes, and living things tend to have more of the lighter ones compared to the heavier ones, and so do these zircons. For many scientists, it's hard to believe that life could possibly be that old. For one thing, Earth was pelted by asteroids 3.8 billion years ago in what was called the Late Heavy Bombardment. Next time you look up at the moon, check out the craters. A lot of them came from the Late Heavy Bombardment. And as we can infer from what happened to the dinosaurs, asteroid impacts are not the best for the survival of living things. But some analyses suggest that the Late Heavy Bombardment would have wiped out only most of life, not all of it. So if there were any living things that old, some of them could have survived. Either way, we're more confident about those fossils that are 3.5 billion years old. They're called stromatolites, and they're made up of layers laid down by films of bacteria. Stromatolites are pretty uncommon today, although you can find them living in Australia's Shark Bay. But pretty much up until the time grazing animals evolved 500 million years ago and started eating all of the bacteria lying around, they were an extremely widespread form of life. That means they basically ruled the Earth for a solid 3 billion years. They may look like slimy lumps of rock, but stromatolites are actually kind of incredible. Even if life only goes back 3.5 billion years, that's still pretty amazing because it means that Earth was about 1 billion years old when the first life emerged. That's not a whole lot of time, especially since the continents and oceans and stuff were still forming. So it might not have been that hard for life to get started. The hard part would have been staying alive once there was oxygen everywhere. A few kinds of microorganisms make stromatolites. One of them is cyanobacteria, and cyanobacteria are pretty special. Instead of acquiring energy from their environments, like the other first organisms, cyanobacteria could capture energy from the sun. They could photosynthesize. Photosynthesis seems to have evolved in the Archaean, but didn't really kick into high gear until early in the Proterozoic. That's because the water cycle needed time to work on the brand new continents. Water weathers continents. It carries sediment into the sea, and that creates a shallow region around the shore, the continental shelf. The continental shelf is great for photosynthesis because it's shallow and gets plenty of sun. But photosynthesis has a nasty, chemically voracious, toxic byproduct. Oxygen, one of the most greedy electron-stripping elements on the periodic table. It reacts with practically anything. It's where we get the word oxidizing for chemically stealing electrons. Once continental shelves formed, the cyanobacteria started pumping out oxygen like there was no tomorrow. And for many of the anaerobic or oxygen-intolerant life forms on the planet, there was no tomorrow. They weren't used to oxygen and they couldn't handle it. It was poison to them. It reacted with and destroyed them. All that oxygen even changed the rocks. It reacted with iron that had been dissolved in the oceans, laying down bands of iron ore that we still find today. Earth basically rusted. But there was another problem. The cyanobacteria also pulled those carbon-containing greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. Earth's temperature plunged. In the early Proterozoic, and again near the end, maybe twice, the planet became a snowball. Life nearly poisoned and then froze itself to death. Cyanobacteria changed the atmosphere so much they destabilized the climate and changed the composition of the Earth itself. Eventually, the volcanoes coughed up more greenhouse gases and the snowball thawed out. Cold-tolerant forms of life managed to survive the crisis. And some organisms learned not only to put up with oxygen, but to use it to make energy. They became aerobic life forms, but many anaerobic organisms had to either find a place to hide or kick the bucket. Life is easy, but surviving is hard, and so is becoming any more complex than a single simple cell. Life stayed single-celled for 2 billion years or so, and it only changed because something really weird happened. That something weird was endosymbiosis. Sometime in the Proterozoic, before 2.1 billion years ago, an anaerobic cell ate an aerobic bacterium, one that used oxygen to produce energy. And the bigger cell never digested the smaller one. The smaller one kept on living, using oxygen and producing energy, and there was so much surplus energy that the bigger cell benefited from having the little guy in there. Eukaryotic cells, the ones with nuclei, have the descendants of these aerobic bacteria inside them. They are our mitochondria. That convenient energy arrangement paved the way for life to become more complex, and all because of a weird fluke. Except maybe it wasn't that weird, because it happened again. The ancestor of plants engulfed a cyanobacterium, which kept right on doing its photosynthesis thing, and now plants have chloroplasts. The earliest possible evidence for multicellular life is 2.1 billion years old, but it could have just been a colony of single-celled organisms. The earliest multicellular eukaryotes we can be fairly confident about are 1.5 billion years old. Animals didn't show up until 600 to 800 million years ago. Late in the Proterozoic and into the next geologic time period, animal life established the groundwork for every kind of animal body plan that still exists today. And that's probably a good place to pick up next time. The start of the Phanerozoic eon, which includes the animal's rise to power and the biggest extinction.
For your group activity, you're going to construct and design your own geologic timescale that will serve as your guide to remember the certain important events in each era, epoch, and periods. Be unique and creative. For your group outputs, we're going to provide pictures before, during, and after the activity. Your final output of your geologic timescale and guide question with answer. For your guide questions, 1. What is the importance of geologic timescale and why scientists prefer to use it? 2. How do fossils help biologists understand the history of life on Earth? 3. How did life on Earth change from one period of geologic time to the next? For your individual activity, you're going to fill in the data table to show the number of millions of years each era lasted. So, you're going to round percent to nearest 0.5% to make sure they add up to 100%. 2. Create a pie chart to show the percentage of time each era of geologic time represents in the geologic time scale. Indicate legends by coloring the given percentage division of geologic time. 3. Write the appropriate periods of the following important events in time. 4. What do you notice about the complexity of the fossils as we move through the geologic time scale from the Precambrian times to Quaternary period? What can you conclude from your observation?